Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the eighth and final edition of our Fractures Internationalist teaching series. Today, we're looking at liberatory futures, where we will be asking, what are our imagined liberated futures? How can we build these within and beyond a fractured world? What are the alternatives that social movements are investing time, energy, resources, and solidarity into building and sustaining? Very important questions that we need to take time to analyze and to build new liberatory futures. But also at the same time, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that the irony of the difficulty of looking at liberated futures when we're looking at a current world system that is indeed fracturing, when there are wars happening, when there are people dying every day, when we are seeing indeed the reason why we came up with this series, which is the fracturing of the world system, the fracturing of the world that we know, and trying to get a deeper understanding of where we are, but at the same time remembering that we need to build a future that is equitable and just for all. So just to take a moment, a few seconds, I'd like to have us a few seconds of silence for all the pain and suffering that we're seeing today, to acknowledge that and to remind us why we need to build these liberatory futures. Thank you so much. My name is Shaun Matsheza, and I'm your moderator. I'm your co-moderator for today. Together with colleagues from TNI, Nick Buxton, Jess Graham in the background, we've been putting together this Fracture series in association with partners, NOR, the Alternative Information Development Center, with the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, and the Asia-Europe People's Forum. A big thank you to our co-organizers who have helped us to put together this series, who have brought in speakers, brought in different analyses to help us to understand this fractured moment in global, this fractured global moment, and also helping us to come up with new ideas to get past this moment. For this session, I will be co-moderating with Hakima Abbas. She is an old friend and comrade of TNI since she was the director of the feminist movement AWID. She was one of the advisors for this series and has also helped us connect with some of the speakers, including today's speakers. Hakima is an African feminist strategist and popular educator who's dedicated to the liberation of African peoples globally. I'll come back towards the end of the session, but in the meantime, I'll hand you over to Hakima. Hakima, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shaun. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to talk, as Shaun said, about liberated futures. And when TNI put this series together, the framing was we're in a fractured world and we need to understand it to change it. Today, we're going to talk about what are we changing it to. In this fractured series, we've focused on what we've fought against. And this conversation, the last, focuses on what we're changing it to. As Shaun said, in this time of devastation, of genocide, of war and fascism, it's difficult to talk about another world. Grief leaves really little room for hope. And hope in itself sounds like such a diminutive word in English. To my ear, it sounds fleeting. But perhaps in other languages, there's hope that feels steadfast and full of creation and life, not just a feeling, but really a knowledge. I know that in the political tradition that I was raised in, there were slogans that embodied that kind of hope, like victory is certain. And it's true that while oppression produces contradiction and contradiction produces struggle, so liberation at once is inevitable and is a constant practice. So I want to emphasize that while we're talking in this conversation about liberatory practice, we're not talking about pipe dreams or utopias. These are real, existing, and in construction practices of revolutionary work. And as we sometimes bend under the crush of defeat or the enormity of the systemic change that we need, there are practices that sustain possibility, that show us what is and can be different. By way of examples, in Black history, these include palenqueros, marine communities that constructed Black sovereignties surrounded by the colonial slave societies. There are also the schools and clinics and stores of the liberated zones of Guinea-Bissau, where solidarity economies thrived. So today I'm really excited that I get to speak to some of my favorite people, Kali Akuno, Ossome, Blessol Gathoni, and I also want to celebrate that this is the Blackest and queerest session in the series, which makes me very happy. So let me introduce the fam. Kali Akuno is an organizer, educator, and writer. He's the co-founder and co-director of Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi in the United States. You will see a full bio in the chat. Blessol Gathoni is a Kenyan activist, systems strategist, and co-founder of Sociable Weavers, a queer collective fostering socio-ecological regeneration. And Lynn Ossome is an academic specializing in feminist political theory and feminist political economics. She's an associate professor and director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research at Makerere University in Uganda. I'm going to remind all the speakers not to speak too fast, and remind the audience that you can use captions if that's helpful to follow and to make this conversation more accessible. And while I want to encourage us, the four of us, to be in conversation, I also want to invite the audience to be in conversation with us and to interact with us in the chat. And to use the Q&A function for any questions that you have for the speakers as they speak. So I'm going to kick it off by asking our audience a question, which is, what does a liberated future look like for you? Please do answer that in the chat and give us a sense of what that looks like for you. And now I'm going to turn to Kali. Kali, brother. You at Corporation Jackson talk about the build and fight strategy. And I would love to hear more about what that strategy looks like and how it connects resistance to the construction of liberated futures.
Well, let me do my best, as I could talk about this all day, to be as succinct as possible. You know, there's a set of practices that this strategy is kind of built upon and promoting. And these practices we view are building blocks towards constructing a new mode of production, just to make that very clear. And within that, one that we are trying to leverage to break the logic of, you know, the capitalist kind of mode of production and the inherent relationships of exploitation, of marginalization, of othering that the system requires in order to both differentiate those who do mental from manual work and then how those are compensated and viewed, and create both income inequalities, gendered inequalities that the system has to construct over and over again in order for there to be a way to both exploit folks and extract the profits that the system requires to even just sustain itself. And what this has also really been built upon from our perspective is trying to deal with this general sense of inadequacy that the left broadly has been kind of confronting, I would say, for much of the last 30 years, in this belief that just because we don't have, you know, like the political parties of old in their mass form, that we don't have enough. That we are encouraging folks to take a step back and to look at all the various experimental projects that folks are doing on their own, in many cases to kind of meet some of their own needs. And if you step back and you really aggregate, you begin to see that it's not a question that we don't have enough. It's a question of we're not sufficiently coordinated. We're not sufficiently organized. But I would wager with anybody that all throughout the planet now, right, in every continent, there are folks who are engaged in autonomous food production. There are folks who are engaged in various practices of mutual aid. There are folks who are involved in all forms of autonomous kind of labor organizing, right? To either meet insufficient kind of material need, to challenge the instruments of capital. But these things are happening. Then there are folks who are experimenting both with new technology and old technology, and the combination of both to kind of produce goods and services on an as-need basis rather than just a commodified basis. And there are tons of folks who are experimenting with new forms of digital communication, right, to kind of bypass either government censorship or bypass the limitations of communication imposed by the likes of the major institutions which call themselves social media, that we are experimenting en masse in our millions with all of these different things. And we've actually gained a lot of traction throughout the world in figuring out how to work in the margins, how to work in the cracks, to create things that people are using to meet their fundamental daily needs. And they exceed that to not only kind of survive, but in many cases, and in small ways, to thrive, right? And to create new liberatory cultures and practices. Now, just imagine a world where all these different things came together, where the mutual aid was directly tied, to the autonomous food sovereignty work, that was tied to the new forms of labor organizing, that was tied to the fab labs and the maker spaces, that was tied to the new social digital kind of technology, the new social digital commons. They were all working collaboratively to plan out and coordinate mutual exchange, right? To plan out production, to make sure that we don't, exceed or produce a lot of waste, to coordinate and facilitate better water use, better sanitation. Like all these things are within our grasp and are being experimented on small scales. We need to aggregate them in their whole through broad democratic practices, right? That is this piece that we're promoting around people's assemblies and other forms of kind of direct participatory, democracy. If we can put all these different things together, then we can make a fundamental challenge of starting to articulate a new mode of production. It won't be without a struggle, because we're still going to have to deal with all the different forces, the multinationals who want to crush our activities, who don't want to see us autonomous, and then the different nation states in either their neocolonial or just parasitic forms that serve, the multinationals, right, or their own wanting to kind of crave onto power for their own kind of personal aggrandizement and accumulation. But we are witnessing a world which is breaking down. Its center cannot hold almost anywhere. And from that, through these cracks, all these new practices are emerging. And it's up to us, I think, to facilitate conversations and engagements where we bring folks together to develop these new practices to create the new world. That is what we have been trying to push, and that's what the Build and Fight formula and the strategy we've articulated that encompasses all the activities I mentioned, puts them together to say that we can construct a new world. And we're experimenting with that with Jackson and other networks, because we want to be a living model eventually over time that folks can point to and say, this is how they did it in Atlanta, be it with community movement builders, with Native Roots Networks out in Reading, and for us to be example to say, like, we adopted this and push this, not to be exclusive, but to demonstrate in practice is what other communities and peoples can do to start liberating themselves and creating new social relationships.
Thank you, Kali. You talked about cracks, and it made me think of the Zapatista and their note on the cracks in the wall. Even as we talk about another world is possible, obviously a lot of that inspiration coming from those movements. Some of the folks in the chat also mentioned Rojava as examples of some of this experimentation. I want to come back to you after I go to Blessol and Lynn, because you mentioned it there at the end, the forces, the multinationals, the states, etc. And I'm wondering what are the possibilities and limitations of building these, even as we aggregate them, these liberated zones within this fractured world, within the states that are still captured. But let me first go to Blessol. Blessol, Gathoni, you talk in your work about queering liberation. Can you say more about what African queer theory and practice brings to liberation practices?
Thank you for that question, Hakima. And I want to come back also to what Khalid spoke about in a bit, but I think as an African queer organizer, my practice, which has informed theory, has been in identifying how queerness is and has been embedded in the African liberation practice or in designing the African citizen. I believe there is no single African queer theory, but there's been theorization around the African queer experience and history in the last couple of decades, including how that has been important in the liberation attempts and efforts. It's something that's more available in African feminist movement theory. It's there in the academic text around gender and sexuality and transnational dialogues among continental Africans and the diaspora. I think I want to speak to something more, I don't know if it's tangible, something that I've noted in doing queer organizing on the continent. And I want to bring things that I think are both practices, exploration into other imagination, and also the things I feel queer organizing brings into the liberation practices on the continent. One of them, in terms of the imagination infrastructure, is the notion of being African as being queer in the face of modernity. I think the experience of Africanness under the Western modernity has meant that we are constantly othered, misread, or even unintelligible. And Africanness in its tradition, logics, timelines, and ways of being disrupts and troubles the dominant Western narrative of modernity. And in this space, I think queerness has rubbed up against the idea of the post-colonial independent struggles that define the African citizen as a person who values the family unit as the most important unit to neoliberal capitalism, also as a means to organize land, society, and governance of resources and culture, and also has rubbed us up against heteronormativity as a function of reproducing and ensuring means of production. And I think queerness on the continent has asked, how do we grasp or create an imagination infrastructure that focuses on future making and memory as an attempt to reach out to an Africa that is buried deep within the current reality? So basically, what does it mean to reclaim our identity from the identity that was created by colonialism? The second thing that I've seen queer African practice bring is the question of collaboration and action at the global scene. And I think it has collaborated at transnational and global levels to challenge the notion of the human and the human rights framework and its mechanism. So this is where I think we see a lot of queer work. There's been a lot of rough edges and tension. There's no need of romanticizing that work. There's been formal organizing and bilateral multilateral conversation at the UN. There's been transnational organizing within Black queer feminist forums and matches, basically in conversations like Fees Must Fall, Palestine organizing on the continent, and also Black Lives Matters, and also imagination of temporary autonomous zones. In grassroots organizing, there's been peers and comrade and other struggles coming together around sex workers movements, conversations on gender-based violence, and what we saw happening the other day with Gen Z organizing in Kenya. The other thing I found really beautiful in the ways in which queer imagination comes into liberation practices on the continent is the question of continuity. And this is the calling of the last reference point. So basically, where might our struggles of the yesteryears hit a dead end or ruptured? And how can we bring this conversation intergenerationally and in deep community through healing? This is where I've seen queer feminist practice also on the continent come and has been working knee-deep to the questions of right relations to land, reparative and restorative justice. And the last one is where my work has been, which is around resilient refusal. and building kinship. So basically, how do we work with relationality versus productivity, the practice of love and rebellion beyond productivity and reproductivity, and how do we bring queerness as part of the human design in deeply bringing community. So basically here we invite the frames of gender and sexuality and organizing against fascism, that has continually dictated bodies as plantations or modes of reproduction for capitalism. The other thing in practice is queerness brings ideology and radical framing, a refusal of capture, categorization, and coherence. I think fucking with gender has been something that has been very important to the African identity, and queerness brings the question and recognition of our bodies as the last territory. And the last thing, and it's something that we're working out, is how do we create a space where queerness and land stewardship comes together. So basically, queer people and the question of land has always been a future project. And how do we bring it to now as a form of radical imagination in decolonizing, of practicing decoloniality on the question of land in Africa? I think I will stop it at that.
Thank you. That was deeply rich. And you're giving us so much to think about. I want to come back to you around this idea of decolonizing of land and queerness, but also that co-optation around the human rights and more neoliberal, liberal framings. But first, I'm going to come to you, Lynn. Actually, I'm also going to tie, though, something. I just read, Lynn, a piece of yours, Pedagogies of Feminist Resistance in Africa. And in that, you also talk about what Gathoni was just talking about, which was bodies as the last territory and as territory of resistance. So there's something really important and interesting there. But Lynn, my question to you is, you've focused on agrarian movements in the Global South and written about feminist pedagogies of resistance in relation to these agrarian movements. How do you vision land and rural movements and communities, particularly women and gender expansive people, in liberatory futures?
Thanks, Hakima, and thanks, Kali and Gathoni. So, I mean, first is we have to, and I think what we are all doing initially is to try to understand the nature of the problem, the nature of the crisis, the nature of the fractures, which we know is there. I mean, I think we're at a time when, there's a lot of crisis, but there's also a lot of hope. You said it earlier, Kima, when you're talking, that, the contradictions have to express themselves as the possibility of struggle itself. So it's, in a sense, I'm hopeful in many ways. But in terms of these agrarian questions, one of my major concerns has been, of course, to understand clearly what is the nature of our societies in the third world. Most of our societies are still largely agrarian, right? Wherever you look, it is 60, 70, 80% agrarian economies. And the problem is that all of these societies are being pushed into a discourse of industrialization, right? When we think of the agrarian question, which was, how do we marshal agriculture in order to industrialize? But the reality is that many of our societies are actively deindustrializing. There is massive amounts of people being pushed out of of industry, of manufacturing. There are no jobs. We have a huge surplus population, actually a massive surplus population, which we have to pay attention to. And so our thinking has been, how do we think of, not even if we don't say social reproduction, how do we think of how these people are staying alive? Because these are people who have been disavowed by the state. Capital doesn't care. We are in a financialized stage of capital, which will go on whether people are working or not. So there's a large majority of people who simply don't matter. And so the social reproduction question comes back very strongly, because we have to keep asking ourselves, how are people surviving? How are they staying alive? And you know, the mere fact that we're not walking on the streets, we know the situation, but we're not walking on the streets and jumping over dead bodies means somebody is doing that work of taking care of people and keeping them alive. And to me, it is those people, that elsewhere, that we have to pay attention to, because it is a domain not just of reproduction, but also of class struggle proper, and we have to pay attention to it. The second is, of course, just to note this crisis tendency in capitalism, right? Capital is hugely dependent, historically has been hugely dependent on a social substratum, this kind of reproductive substratum, to meet the daily needs and the generational needs of working people, but it can ignore it. It doesn't it doesn't resource it in any way, right? So in a sense, when we think about this question in the global South, in the third world, what I like to think of as the agrarian South, right, is that we do not have we've not followed the same trajectory of advanced capitalist countries that at some point had this kind of welfare state or welfarist regimes that still persist in some places like in South Africa, but not on the whole continent. So what is the domain? And that domain, we've tried to think about it concretely as land and the commons and all these resources, nature itself. I like to think of it in terms of nature more broadly, and the defense of those domains that are keeping people alive. And the reason that we can't ignore this question is, when you look at most working class households, most working people today cannot actually feed themselves on the basis of wages alone. In fact, wages constitute a very small percentage of what is keeping working class households alive. Most working class households are dependent on a combination of wages, some kind of income from petty commodity trade, and some kind of access to subsistence agriculture. We saw this very much in COVID. There are all these questions of, if everything that was said about Africa, for instance, was true, many of us would have died like bees. But we saw this subsistence economy, this rural economy really kicking in. So this kind of combination of domains of reproduction are, in a sense, enjoined by a structure of gendered labor, right? Which is mostly women, but not only women. So in a sense, we see gender in this way, gendered labor itself, emerging as a contemporary question, not just an agrarian question, but seriously a political question that we have to again bring back. We are seeing the absolute immiseration of working people. Again, in contrast to the colonial period where people could go everywhere else to look for land, working people today simply have nowhere to go. In fact, that's the link I've been making with what Gathoni was saying about bodies, just gendered bodies becoming the last domain of accumulation. It's not just commoditized. It's a domain of accumulation, which means it's also a domain of violence, of profound violence against working people. Why is the state responding so violently to people who are expressing these questions of survival and reproduction? The other thing is, and so people have simply nowhere to go. Just two more things. One is, if we accept the logic, it's a very simple logic that land, the peasantry is not disappearing. At least in much of the third world, it's not disappearing, and therefore land remains relevant, right? It remains, even though, you know, of course, we will be shown the statistics that say, oh, agriculture does not contribute to the GDP much. You know, it's not, and if anything, it is kind of the agribusiness path. But we have to insist that land and nature and access to the commons remains relevant. And when we do this, then, I mean, I refuse to give up on the state, and I know Hakima and I would have a debate around this. But I think that we still, you know, the state still matters, at least in this phase of the struggle. And so, you know, we can think of the redistributive role of the state in mediating land and agrarian reforms, this kind of thing. But we also need to really think about what kind of state do we need to fight over, right? And I think Gathoni said something really interesting. You made a very interesting statement about how queerness has been embedded in designing the African citizen. You know, we really need to be thinking about what is the kind of state, for instance, that feminist agrarian struggles envision and are fighting over. And lastly is to just say that we can't overly romanticize the peasantry because of the colonial logic, which Kali was talking about, that you know, governed or responded to these native questions through the question of difference, right? Whether it is race or gender or ethnicity or sexuality, those things still remain very much embedded among working people. And so even as we are struggling and trying to think of a different kind of state, a different mode, we have to pay attention to these contradictions that are internal to working people ourselves, right? Otherwise, they keep expressing themselves in new ways. So, you know, our commitment to liberation is threatened if we free one set of social forces at the expense of another. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lynn. You mentioned the ways, the immiseration of the working people, particularly in the global South, and particularly in the African continent, and this moment of capitalism that creates the elsewhere. It made me think of that statistic, something like 83% of employment is informal in Africa. When that is the number, it feels like, well, that is the center, that is the economy. And that economy expresses itself with a completely different logic, a logic that I think is also has some elements of what Kali was talking about around mutual exchange, planning production, not producing waste, trying to think about those ways. And so again, at the margins where these experiments get put into practice of liberation. And this is also what happens when you have a panel of folks that know you very well. So you know what I'm going to say about the state. Thank you, Lynn. I love it. But I wanted to come to you, Kali, around this question of the state. You talked about aggregating the experiments and the possibilities around that. But when we're in this moment where most states, not all, are still captured, where we are facing the threat of these huge, as you said, multinationals, etc., where capitalism is as crippling as Lynn described, what are the possibilities, or how do we keep building liberated zones? What are the limitations as well? What have you faced as Corporation Jackson, also sitting in the belly of the beast?
You have to forgive me, everybody, for some of the noise in a university setting. And okay, I think we have to make distinctions between like the national governments, if you would, and more local expressions of government. And that's different in different countries. So, but like in the United States, there's what we call municipalities, right? Your city government or your county government or parish government. Oftentimes, given the local dynamics and the local knowledge and the local relationships, there's often more space to mediate and negotiate, with the forces, the local forces from below, with the forces that are nominally in control of the state apparatus. And they are more likely in most environments to have to respond, or at least want to respond to local needs, because their needs are also getting served, by having good roads or good infrastructure, that they also need, for their own reproduction, right? Social reproduction. So there's more of a particular way of like wanting to balance certain things out that you will often find at a local level that you won't find at the national level. And particularly in the, since the era where the neoliberal project on a global scale has become dominant, the national government is fundamentally just a site of extraction. What can we extract from the local, in all the different places where the local winds are being expressed. And I think one of the critical pieces that we've seen, I would argue at least since 1994, to invoke what you brought up, with the Zapatistas, now that was more kind of regional at scale, but what they had tapped into, I'm gonna go back to, was like the fracture of where Chiapas, right, was on the margin of the Mexican state and Mexican society and all the corresponding practices of exploitation and extraction. They said that, we can carve out, we think that we can carve out a space wherein the state is not, conditioned to try to meet our local needs, but rather to just extract resources from this area, primarily in the form of, materials and wood and things of that nature. We need to adopt things that take care of our own, material and social needs. And they went and experimented on creating a local kind of autonomous project. And they were very kind of, in hindsight, we can say that they were very clear, and that they were not trying to engage in the fragmentation of the society in the form of like the civil wars that were being, practiced, say, like at the same time. But, people that by that time had seen 20-something years, for example, of civil war and the way it was ravaging Colombia, right? Despite kind of the left orientation of some of the projects, there, they were kind of, engaged in massive destruction of the environment. They were engaged in practices that were often exploitive of indigenous and Afro communities, that were kind of conscripting folks at different points in time to be involved. And they said very deliberately, we're going to start with our cultural reference and cultural base, on a broad democratic, a level, to encourage and motivate people through organizing and through the construction of a new narrative to join in a transformative process, right? Rather than just being coerced into one. But they started at that local level is what I'm trying to bring up. So they created, in essence, like a dual power strategy. That's not the language that they necessarily use, but that's in essence what they've created. And there's one in that we've tried to very intentionally adopt. Our project has drawn very heavily from a lot of the examples of the Zapatistas. And we very much tried to adopt it in the sense of like, we can't challenge the national government in our context in the United States, right? It's the most powerful and destructive entity on the planet, as everybody is fully aware of, I think, in this audience. So trying to just go head up with that, we're not immediately going to win that struggle. We knew that. And even at the state level, in our case, the settler state of Mississippi, hard for us to challenge that directly. But in a place like Jackson, where our people constitute the numeric majority, we wanted to use that to our advantage and to say, let's create a dual power situation where we can, to the best possible, force the government through our mass organization and mass mobilization and building of our own independent kind of institutions and set of practices. We can force a negotiation with it to act right, to the greatest extent possible, and be responsive to the needs of the people. If that's just create the space for these projects from below to emerge without too much intervention or any intervention at all, or to bend the rules when and where possible, or to let us know where there are resources that we might be able to tap into that are being underutilized or that we could utilize in a new way to kind of extend our project. And so some of the things we try to tap into in our area because of, deindustrialization that's been going on there for 30 years. Like you got all these excess buildings, you have all this excess, housing for folks who've kind of left to go to bigger cities. That is being underutilized, if not utilized at all, and is deteriorating and becomes a source of waste, if you would, and a burden on the city for the lack of taxes. Let us put that back into productive use, but we need you to make this open and available. So we're making a demand, but a demand that fits in like this will actually help the municipality bring in more tax revenues, put it back in a social use so you don't have to destroy it or have to cut the grass. Let the people take care of that and manage that as the new commons. So I think if we kind of have this kind of orientation of figuring out where these more local entities are weak and where they could use the reinforcement of the people to kind of elevate so that what it can do can then be in a broader service, but create a new space which is more commons, and socially organized rather than just being a public space in the traditional sense of how that's kind of emerged in the West. We can find ways to kind of, I'm not going to say grow, but we can level some things out to meet folks' needs within the social limits and the ecological limits of which we ascribe. Because what we do, we have to be very mindful, I think, of what is the way we're going to address the long-term sustainable needs of our people and the land which sustains us. And to put our right relationship, as we would say in the United States, with the land as being kind of a primary source of all life. And without that being healthy, we might as well, call it in, because we when we come to kind of sit back and recognize that, what we call civilization, or what has been called that, is really dependent upon a very thin layer of topsoil. And then if we don't take care of that and be knowledgeable about that and put ourselves back, this is all, the capitalist system is going to render this whole thing, as we understand it, it's going to crash and burn on its own. And so it's up to us to kind of be in a situation that we want our grandchildren and their great-grandchildren to be around. Then we have to start planning for that. And that means, to a great extent, whatever you may call it, I'll call it a degrowth kind of imperative of that we have to start living in the sustained relationship within the limits of the environment to make sure that the earth can regenerate what we all need. And for that, we have to go back to draw on part of what Blessol was building upon that. We have to kind of reclaim our traditional indigenous knowledge bases that every people on every square inch of the planet who lives someplace had to draw upon for millennia in order to sustain ourselves. And we need to really challenge these notions of development. Like, what does that mean? And is that something we ultimately want? Because if, the system that imperialism, basically, colonialism, imperialism have produced, have brought us in the span of basically 300 years to the point of human extinction. And if that is development, then I definitely want something else, right? We need something else. And your notion of what that means are utterly absurd. And we have to find a new way. And then we need to point back to our folks that live for, 500,000, if not more years, in most places in harmony with the natural environment. And that our societies were far more developed at producing and not overtaxing the other species in our environment or the earth itself to sustain itself. We have to reverse and undo and decolonize our own minds even further, right, with the smaller active verb sense of the decolonization to get us into that kind of mindset and really look at how do we really articulate this thing? Because if we're stuck in this kind of developmental state, which most of our nation states and most of our movements are really kind of articulated at, we're going to run into the same dead end that this system is running. We're just going to be kind of reproducing at maybe at a slower pace and a slower rate. We're going to eventually run into those same contradictions if we keep some of these frameworks. So we really have to challenge ourselves to undo them.
Absolutely. And I think in a couple of conversations ago in this series, the existential ecocide and the ways in which we're experiencing collapse right now was discussed as well in this frame that I think if we take that seriously, so much else changes, including how we understand, who we understand to be experts and things. Just bringing it back to what Lynn was saying, there are movements in Africa of rural women, like We Are the Solution, who are saying, we're the scientists, we're adapting to climate change. If y'all just need to actually pay attention to the solutions that we're bringing to the table. I mean, I think what all of you are bringing, interestingly, is the question of land. We know Malcolm, when he was talking about liberation movements all over the globe, said land is the basis of liberation, of freedom. Blessol, I just want to come back to you on this question, because as you mentioned in your first response, queer liberation is often co-opted into this human rights language, but you're centering African queer liberation with land and decoloniality. Can you say more about that relationship and how you see that on the African continent?
I think in trying to find expression, and as many of you have pointed out, in a world that is increasingly extractive and violent and unpredictable, queer liberation attempts have been encapsulated into the equality, gender mainstreaming kind of human rights dialogues. And in also listening to some of the things that Kali and Lynn have said, we have to also understand the role of human life, right, as a project, a failing project created by a colonial fantasy. And land stewardship has also been encapsulated, not into only the human rights language, but into this neoliberal capitalism trope. And when I look at this conversation in relation to the continent, the land is not free on the continent. It's private property controlled by the means of production that the global market dictates. I see as the citizen in the continent is not free. In fact, they are abandoned in this polycrisis, right? And one of our brothers, Bayo Komolafe, says the crisis that we are in is how we're responding to the crisis. And I look at what's happening right now in terms of the polycrisis as things not being cared for properly. And to various degrees, if you look at conversations of extrajudicial killings in Kenya, for example, the African citizen is not free. The culture is also not free. And it's an inevitable outcome of capitalism and conquest, right? And we have to keep looking most of the time when we're looking at right relations to land and colonialism in Africa and how Africa queer liberation comes into it, that we're still working within a very dominant paradigm. I love the way in which Kali spoke about deep time and how our societies were not formed by overtaxing other species, and how can we go back to that, right? And so whenever I'm looking at the question of the global population and how it's segregated, it's a mass class struggle, as Lynn pointed out. And the perfect neoliberal individual consumer is the white man. And it's always positioned against the third world population, whose role is to act as labor or resource to the production that needs to happen for this white consumer neoliberal individual to thrive. And I think queerness has been encapsulated into wanting to belong to the consumer category, and has aligned its mode of being to that. And I think right now I want to say, like, there's a need in my body right now to call for an understanding why the African queer would easily be seduced by the idea of attaining the status of the human with rights, who's also an individual, who's also a consumer in a society that has responded to queerness with violence and profiling and miming, right? And so, but in this moment, when you ask me to speak more about the relationship of land and how it is that I see the question of land decoloniality and liberation, I think the plot has been for a long time, and for a lot of liberation movements, and what we are learning from indigenous struggles who are not part of this kind of terrain of the human, is we have to keep challenging the Western notion of the human, and keep reminding ourselves that in the fantasy where the human is removed from the natural resource or from nature, then we have the biggest myth of separation that we've suffered for the last centuries. So the context that we are working in as queer people at present, in terms of land and decolonizing the conversation of land, is from an understanding that most of our lands are still tied up to multinational corporations and the control of settler colonial power, or infrastructures of control that come from settler colonial power. We are in a moment of unprecedented investment in alternatives. And it's heartbreaking, because in the process of that imagination and responding to what is freedom and how can we take refuge from the polycrisis, there's been a kind of erasure, a deliberate erasure of the ways in which queerness has informed these conversations and has been part of the imagination infrastructure of freedom as place, as territory, and as land. And then we are faced with a conundrum in this part where we do not want to make queer lives also entirely encapsulated into this modern person or into this capitalism fantasy or its notions of intimacy, kinship, and production. And at the same time, there is a feeling in this imagination of alternatives of isolation, right, from the land itself, from the wisdom and knowledges that have existed on the actual lands of the African continent. And we are wondering, how do we grapple with the undervaluing of queerness and how queer people have practiced otherwise as a source of knowledge in this project of ushering alternatives to capitalism and its violence. And then there's this question about how do you take fugitivity? How do you become a fugitive of the human, right? And so there's the reality of what human rights has enabled on the continent. We wouldn't have been able to speak, even be in this room or walk our talk, if there wasn't the availability of civil rights movements, of feminist movements, of various actions and groups and collectives saying there's the right of the queer African citizen to be able to participate in their own state-making and citizen processes. But I think there's a way of being able to say we can see and know that, and also move towards identities that are about moving away from the palatable queer, which is the one that has been mostly ushered and allowed and belong to the human right conversation. And right now we are centering very hard questions around how do we reconnect our conversations about what it means to have a queer on the land, lesbians on the land and all that conversation, to the question of what the people who fought for the liberation movements did, right? How do we find this reference point of where our struggles ruptured, what you call fracture right now, to understand that the grief we have in this moment, the rough edges are about us going through the necessary changes that we need to go through in the conversation of land in the continent. And I think, yeah, that's my point about how, what I imagine queer practices and the questions of liberation of land on the continent and how queers can participate, whether as a question or as a community and as a conversation around freedom as place in this moment. Yeah.
Thank you, Gathoni. And I'm seeing how that fugitivity and insurrection, and within that, the construction of liberatory practices. Lynn, can you give us some examples of the ways in which communities, in the agrarian communities in particular, are resisting and building alternatives in the global South? What lessons can we learn from these experiences? I know Kali's provided some very practical ways in which that was constructed in Mississippi. Could you give us a sense of how that is in the global South, in agrarian communities?
Yeah, I mean, first is to, historically, when we look at, anti-colonial struggles, for instance, on the continent, so it's a very historical question, and there's always been a kind of usurping of women's struggles into a broader narrative that, again, but if you look at, Kenya, for instance, what sparked the Mau Mau movement proper was not these native men going out and saying, they eventually joined a struggle that was initiated by women, by rural women who could see very well what the colonial state and the colonial appropriation of their labor towards productive agriculture was doing, right? So women could see that they were being removed from these kinds of kinship modes of production and reproduction and being pulled into a colonial political economy. And they started to resist that, and in very active ways, in very subversive ways. And then it caught on eventually, and then the mass of oppressed native populations joined into the struggles. We've seen it in anti-colonial struggles here in Uganda, which emerged from kind of spiritual movements. What has been striking to me is that a lot of those struggles that women and gendered communities were waging very early on were related to land. They were articulating their spiritual connections to the land and the reproductive significance they attached to land. At present, what we are seeing, of course, is a neo-colonial scramble for land, which has been underway for the last decade and a half, but of course, which has a longer history with economic liberalization from the late 1980s, right? And this, which basically, paved the way for a kind of second wave, which we are seeing now, which is a scramble over food, over energy, financial capitalism and all its speculative tendencies that are, just taking whole tracts of land for nothing but speculation, right? And we cannot feed ourselves. So this loss of common lands that is related to land acquisitions has been a basis of struggle. Because that's the sad thing, because it's not just that agrarian communities are struggling against the capital and the state, which mediates this relationship with capital, of course, and the state is in a very contradictory relationship because it cannot mediate rights if it is also very much the guarantor of capital itself. But we are also seeing struggles below, real struggles between landless people or effectively landless people. And we have to pay attention to that. I mean, my sense has been that we have to really kind of read agrarian struggles from below in order to understand the kind of political wage, let alone the social wage that it imposes on anybody who's trying to think of a different future. Of course, these struggles from below are a sign of extreme distress that I was talking about earlier, that massive people are being expanded from industry and mass. And I think that a distinct sense that is shared among agrarian movements today is that what we are waging today is not just a struggle over land, but it's also fundamentally an ecological struggle. And what does that mean? And of course, that has to be grounded in a liberation ethic. Now, this is where when I think of the lessons, one is, the question of sovereignty has to really come back properly into our discussion. In the previous, historically, we've talked about an agrarian question of industrialization. And now we have to talk about an agrarian question of liberation. And what does that mean, right? Is that this agrarian question of liberation articulates very clearly that we have to have the capacity among us to safeguard our own external relations and internal balances. We have to be sovereign, not just as people, but as nations. So it, of course, it busts it into the broader discourses of the anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist movements, which I think, and which I've been arguing, causes some problems in terms of our capacity to really learn from feminist movements, right? Mm-hmm. Because one is, one of the feminist, movements I've looked at here in Uganda is, in the north, where, of course, capital is trying to take these huge tracts of land, and women eventually, old women eventually go and have what is called a naked protest, right? They strip in front of the government, and it's very scandalizing and so on, and there's a retreat. But the analysis, one either thinks of it, of course, rightly, I think the cultural analysis thinks of it as a symbolic association of women with land. The mainstream left, I think rightly, is thinking about this rise in rural protests as manifested in everyday hidden practices and kind of people trying to secure their means. But concretely, they link them. They say, okay, these women are waging anti-imperialist struggles and anti-capitalist struggles. But, there is a problem with starting from that, in a very basic, simple way. And this is the kind of honoring communities. And, people are not always, people are trying to defend something. What are the people trying to defend, and how are they articulating it? Why do we have to co-opt that discourse and the nature of those struggles and try to place them into things that we can identify, into these concepts that we can identify? Yes, they lend themselves to anti-imperialist struggles, but in a very real way, the forms of resistance that are led by women are an assertion of women's awareness of the life-centeredness that land portends, right? And the fact that the preservation of nature is fundamentally driven by acts of care. These are fundamentally embodied, they're sacred, they're existential in nature. And what does that mean? So in a sense, I think that starting it from there, because sometimes I feel like, and I think Gathoni is talking about this question, the moment we lose, care in itself, there's nothing wrong with. I have a real problem with of course, you've seen it, everyone has taken over the discourse on care economy. Let's make care economy more caring and this kind of thing. They're not talking about social reproduction, because then you have to talk about the structure of exploitation and the history and all those things. Let's talk about the care economy. And of course, it's just, whatever solution might be, okay, let's pay for this labor but there's no cost to care. There's no, I don't think there's nothing fundamentally wrong with caring for each other. That's what we have always been. But I think for colonized people, for racialized people, that has always been accompanied by a reality of a knowledge of our captivity, right? Gathoni was talking about fugitivity. We've always been aware. And to know that you're captive to this kind of labor that capital needs and constantly calls on is, and it means any attempt to try to escape that captivity is invariably met with violence. But an awareness of that, an awareness of what captivity means or what fugitivity means is also necessary. I think that most of the feminist agrarian movements have been pushed to the extreme. We don't need to reach those extremes where we see people stripping in order to confirm that there is extreme distress. But I think an awareness that we are struggling within a system that will not let go. And so there's this threat of violence, and how do we build livable lives on the land and protect the land and protect the nature from the violence itself, because the violence is not just on our bodies, but of course it's on nature itself. I don't have a concrete answer, but I think we can think in those lines.
Thank you so much, Lynn.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you were talking, I was thinking about how this question, which used to be posed as the peasant question, had many different answers in different texts or different thinkers, Cabral, Fanon, and the question of the peasants in the national struggle, as you said. And now we're thinking about agrarian liberation, as you called it. And I wonder if the impetus of the ecocide is creating that necessity to really think back to the land and how we're constructing it. One of the questions in the Q&A, and please, anyone who would like to add a question, please add them, points to climate socialism. Thank you, Mark, for pointing to Jason Hickel's text on climate socialism. And I think we're also really aware of the flip, which is also eco-fascism. The fascist forces are also aware of the climate disaster and considering it, but from a very different angle. So just coming to you, Kali, and some of the question around the ways in which you were talking about the role of development and the kind of development we don't want, and the role of the state. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about those interactions. And before I come back to you, I'm going to just give a couple of questions that are coming from the chat also to Lynn and Gathoni. Another one is, what is the role of boycotts and non-cooperation with states and transnational corporations? How does those roles play in emancipatory liberation so that we can advance shared consciousness and educational empowerment? That's a question from James. And then there's a question directly, I think, to something you mentioned, Lynn, which is, what are the impact of things like the aid budgets cuts? But I would say myself, but even more broadly, what is the impact of this current moment having on the dispossessed that you talked about, Lynn? And what impact does that have on emancipatory futures? One last question for the three of you, and you can each choose which to answer, but is, how do we practice internationalism in liberatory futures? Kali, you talked a little bit about the ways in which coordination might happen. But when we say that these liberatory practices are often embedded at a more municipal or local level, how do we practice internationalism in that context? So I will look to you. Who would like to go first? Maybe Kali, do you want to jump in?
I can jump in. There's a lot there to cover. So let me do my best. There's this question of development is going to continue to be a profoundly fractured one, because the arguments around that in the United States, which are becoming more prominent, we have to really interrogate. So let me be more specific as to what I mean. So a large part of what Trump and the neo-fascists are articulating is that the very world of fragmented, on-time production that was created, largely by U.S. capital to facilitate a world in which consumer goods were going to be readily available to U.S. consumers in the main. They now want to disrupt that system that they created because China has become not only the kind of the world's factory, if you would, but has found some ways to siphon off enough capital, expertise, and overall kind of capacity to not only just be an economic rival, but a military one and a financial and political one. So there's this whole notion that the United States needs to reindustrialize, if only to kind of reinforce and resecure its military advantages, right? Because they don't want to be dependent upon the Chinese any more, or to no more degree that they can't say have access to raw earth materials to supply their own military as their fundamental means of maintaining hegemony. So they're talking about this major reindustrialization program and trying to center that around tech, which is why the tech lords are very strategically on their own accord got kind of galvanized around his presidency and abandoned the Democrats. But we need to be very clear what reindustrialization means. That is not a jobs creation program, and it's not a development program, because what they mean by bringing the auto manufacturing or other forms of manufacturing back, that will largely be automated. And, there'll be maybe 2 or 3 humans who will, make sure the computers function. But otherwise, there'll be robots, making the cars and the computers and the cell phones, et cetera. But that is not an infrastructure that can be readily just developed in a year, 6 months. Like Apple is telling, Trump very clearly, like, if you want us to make Apple, computers and cell phones in the United States again, that's like a 5 to 10 year project. And it's going to require massive forms you don't want to do. So, you're constructing a developmental framework which is actually beyond your capacity to execute. And I wanted to get to that particular point because the major forces of capital are forcing us to all deal with some major challenges. They are no longer able to produce jobs and no longer have a desire to produce jobs en masse. That means without some fundamental program where the states render some form of basic universal income, UBI, there'll be no one to consume or who could be able to afford to consume the world of goods that have been created, particularly after World War II. So you're not only going to have all this excess production and waste, but you have people who won't be able to realize any form of fulfillment within the current kind of social contract to be both good citizens, meaning to be a good consumer and someone who follows the dictates of the state. So that game fundamentally is over, by the logic. Now it's like how that collapses differs in different societies and probably on different timelines and scales. But, a lot of these conversations that are happening, in the global South or the third world around kind of catching up to the West in many respects, because that's still one of the underlying roots, if not the greatest, piece and component that folks are trying to get to, is to be able to consume at the levels that quote unquote Americans are able to consume at. That's a game that cannot be played in any sustainable manner, because just with the amount of consumption that exists now, we fundamentally, if we were trying to extrapolate like this to the other 6 billion people who live on the planet, we need 3 other Earths. And that ain't happening. And trying to colonize the moon, that's not going to work or happen. Because look, the resources it would take to colonize Mars, as Neil deGrasse Tyson points out, if y'all can go colonize another planet, you can fix this one. So the logic around not wanting to fix this one is what we really have to I think, come back and underscore, right? Like they would rather destroy this if it enabled them to maintain control rather than to fix this in a way that would then force them to surrender their control. That's the logic that we are dealing with. And to come back to one of the earlier points, you know, my argument is I'm trying to get to the point, this is just me speaking, I'm trying to get to the point where we don't need this edifice to stand above us, is what's called the state. But I'm not going to sit there and lie to anybody and say the state is going to somehow magically dissolve on its own within the course of my lifetime. So there's a way in trying to build movements that can press the state to, you know, gradually tether with her, but also enable the people to be more self-realized and more emancipated to exercise our own agency, to meet our own particular needs, and to rely upon more social technology than the so-called digital technology as being in the leading edifice to do that, because that's what gets us towards, you know, more practice of regeneration and not just sustainability. Because sustainability gets us to one place. But the fact of the matter is we're going to have to like restore the ecosystems, which means some profound changes. So this notion that I think exists in a lot of the kind of environmentalist movements or the climate justice movement, there's this kind of underlying notion, which is often unsaid, but I think we need to expose, at least in the US context, in the European context, which I know best, the North American, European. There's this kind of general notion that we can have all of this, like all the things you see in the background, we can have all of this if we just moderate it more, if we just regulate the system more, if we could bring capital more to discipline. But we can have all these consumer goods and things can sustain themselves. And the reality is, no, we cannot. Right? Not as individual proprietorship or individual pieces. Like, you know, if we want to use some of this technology, and I don't think we should abandon it in total, but there's a way in which it has to be socialized. It has to be made a common, because we may not all, you know, I don't want to necessarily my kids to live in a world where they automatically, everybody has to have their own individual computer, because I don't think you should be on the computer all that much time, right? There's a world of dealing with your peers and the human beings to create social technology to fulfill the connection that we need as humans, that is going to fulfill our needs, wants, and hearts and desires. That is ultimately what I think we're going to have to feel, but I think it's the question of how do we kind of use what exists in very strategic and mediated forms to move past its limitations. And we are developing the practices to do that. And I think the last point of your question, just to speed it up, you know, we don't do, I'll speak from the cooperation jack, we don't do the local to be small utopian projects. Right? Under the fascist era, which, you know, this new fascism that we're living, that could easily be crushed. We start with where we are because that's where we can have the greatest expression of control, but we have to federate with other folks who to pick up these practices and be in common dialogue and to share our experiences, our practices, our frameworks, and our analysis. Otherwise, we'll be stuck, you know, with the local and the limited, which could easily be destroyed or easily be co-opted.
Thank you, Kali. I think that last point around federated commons is really important and kind of circles right back to the Rojava experience as well. Gathoni and Lynn, we have unfortunately only about 4 minutes for this before we have to hand over to Shaun. So do one of you
I'll
want
say
to come
something
in?
very
Sure.
briefly. Yeah,
Please,
on the impact that, you know, cutting the social wage has on the dispossessed. I mean, one is it's actively feeding. You know, if you look at Sudan, for instance, there's been some really interesting writings about where the militias got the the young men who are going in are basically part of the surplus population. They are just excess. It says, and so they are lending themselves to civil war, to all this military adventurism that we're seeing everywhere. So there's a real danger in that, and we're seeing it happening, that they're being pulled, they're very easily pulled into this. Of course, there is a greater demand on the labor that we, capital, the state thinks it doesn't need to pay, that it thinks does not need a wage, right? So there's just a greater demand on this kind of gendered labor and social and reproductive labor. But I think that, and I think this is the hopeful part, I think that the surplus population is not just this massive excess. They might be to the state, but they are not to us, those who continue to care. And I think that the surplus population pose probably to me the most fundamental political question of our time, because even the most neoliberal of states cannot afford to ignore this population. And Kali made a point that is really important, that, I mean, it still needs consumers. It still needs to have people who will consume this kind of excess commodities that it's producing. But we saw it during COVID. All of these states, all of our states chipped in, came in and gave some kind of social grant in some form. There's a growing discussion on the UBI. My fear is that it's, of course, co-opted by capital, give people just enough to survive and to not, violate the boundaries of the state and so on. So there are many problems, but I think that understanding these populations as a political problem of the state, maybe not of capital, should give us a starting point. On the question of internationalism, again, I agree with Kali. I think I don't think we have a choice. You can't, we have to socialize labor everywhere. There has to be we can't have socialism in one place. It just won't work. We've known this historically. We have to think about how to connect. And I think that there's enough experience and practice and examples of among peoples of the third world that have tried to connect our struggles, and we have to keep doing that.
Thank you so much, Lynn. As you brought up the example of Sudan, I was also thinking about the ways in which the resistance committees, which were, as the name suggests, popular committees for resistance and protest and civil disobedience, but also became sites of the construction and liberatory practice and democratic practice and all of these things that we're talking about today that prefigure, is that the word? This liberated future.
Yes, yes.
Gathoni, last word goes to you.
That's wild. Mine is to just say thank you for the learning that I've had listening to Kali and Lynn, and the fact that I'm gonna be open to a lot of interpretation to what they've shared here today. And somebody asked the question around the role of boycotts. I think there's been a lot of points in this conversation that we've held today that points to a little bit like of knowledge and realization and a deep awareness, collective awareness that we're living under captivity. And I think we have no luxury or time to build the imagination infrastructures needed for our liberation. And so we have to build, as Kali points out, while we are fighting. And I think we have to fight to build a common sense, a shared vision, a praxis value, and imagination infrastructure for our future. What worries and sits with me in this particular moment is that we are seated at a point of polycrisis with an assumption that we're all experiencing it in the same time. I don't think there's a way we are moving towards or from, and I don't think there's a point where we can all organize from the same, understanding. But I think our methodology and methods can help us think about places that are temporary autonomous zones or places of deschooling or decolonization or boycotts as places where, as standpoints or postures that we can assume to fight the structures that perpetuate the violence that we are seeing. And so I have not much to say in this moment apart from what philosophies and what strategies and what visions are we holding behind the boycotts of state and transnational corporations, and how are we involving in this moment of white fragility the people who've been disposed and the cultures and traditions that have been disposed of in the building of the holy trinity of capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy. And yeah, thank you, Hakima, for this invite and the TNI crew.
And of course, that was a mic drop. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Shaun to close us out and to celebrate the series as a whole. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Hakima, and thank you so much to all our brilliant speakers. What an inspiring and amazing conversation. And I think there's going to be many threads to follow and pull through as time proceeds. This was the main goal of this Fracture series. We're living in a world of fundamental change, great change, and the whole goal behind this Fracture series was to understand where these fractures are happening and what opportunities they might bring to movements that are seeking a more just, equitable, and prosperous world for all mankind. It sounds like idealism, but unless we hunker down, unless we put in the work, we will be stuck in this cycle that the capitalist system has created for us. Thank you so much to everyone who has participated in this series from the beginning. Thank you to the Alternative Information and Development Center. Thank you to NOR. Thank you to the Global Network of Movement Lawyers. And thank you very much to the Asia Europe People's Forum and all the different people behind the scenes that have come together to create what has been hopefully an insightful and resourceful series of conversations that we hope everyone can still revisit. All the videos will be put up online, including today's conversation, and a roundup email will be sent to everybody who registered. I would like to encourage you, as we face this polycrisis, as we look at these fundamental changes, to always take a moment to take a deep breath. Remember that we are human beings experiencing this world. Remember that this is not a fake reality. Remember that the suffering that we are seeing is not in a video game. Remember that this is real life, and real life will only change if we all put in our efforts and put in our work to make it a different world. The world has been made by people. The world can be unmade and remade by people. Thank you so much to everyone who has participated. Please send the recordings to other people. Please share the resources that have come up in the chat, and let us continue this conversation. Let us build these federations of cooperation. Let us create these links and make the world better for all of us. Thank you so much. I would like to leave you now with a recap of some of the really interesting insights that we got from this series. Please continue the conversation in the chat, and do feel free to reach out to the Transnational Institute, TNI, if you would like to participate in another follow-up, if you would like to get more resources. We work with the movements, we try to create knowledge for the movements, and we try to understand the world so that we can change it. Thank you so much. If you found any of this useful, please do consider donating to the Transnational Institute or to any of our affiliated partners, because this work requires resources. It requires us to take time, and it really would help us a lot if we could get some of your support. As you can see, many movements, many organizations such as TNI are facing similar funding constraints. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you on the next teaching session.
Thank you. But I have to leave.
Thank you.
Everybody. Yeah. Bye-bye. Yeah.